In 2015, an audacious entrepreneur decided to step into a ring where many believed he had no place. What unfolded next was an impressive demonstration of resilience, worthy of the greatest Stoic thinkers, even though he had never read a single text by Epictetus. How did he face criticism and adversity, transforming challenges into opportunities? Stoic philosophy teaches us that true strength lies in our ability to remain indifferent to chaos. And that's exactly what we observe in his journey. In crucial moments, the concept of amor fati, love of fate, manifested in surprising ways, showing that accepting what we cannot change is the first step towards overcoming obstacles. With every setback, he rose again, proving that the greatest victory is not in avoiding falls, but in having the courage to stand up after each one. By exploring this controversial political phenomenon, this video reveals how ancient lessons of Stoic wisdom can be applied in challenging situations. Get ready to discover the principles of resilience that emerge amid the storm and the mental strength that can arise in the most unexpected moments. Resilience and Stoicism. Resilience is a quality admired in leaders, especially in challenging times. Stoicism, a philosophy that began in ancient Greece, offers valuable lessons on how to deal with life's difficulties. The relationship between these two concepts is essential, as Stoicism teaches that we cannot control everything around us, but we can control how we react. This applies perfectly to politics, where pressure and criticism are constant. Leaders who adopt a Stoic mindset tend to stand out, as they can maintain calm and focus on their goals. In times of crisis, resilience becomes a fundamental asset. Instead of being overwhelmed by difficulties, a Stoic leader understands that adversities are opportunities for growth. They not only acknowledge pain and suffering, but also learn to use them to their advantage. This approach can be observed in political figures who, when facing criticism and challenges, become stronger and more determined in their convictions. For example, during his campaign, Trump faced a series of attacks and criticisms. Rather than veering off course, he clung to his beliefs and principles. This resilient attitude not only helped him overcome tough moments, but also galvanized his supporters. By demonstrating his ability to weather the storms, he became a symbol of strength for many. Stoic philosophy also emphasizes the importance of understanding the nature of things. For a leader, this means accepting that criticism and challenges are part of the package. Instead of fighting against this reality, a resilient leader adapts and learns. This does not mean being indifferent to criticism, but rather approaching it with a constructive perspective, always seeking to improve and evolve. Thus, the synergy between resilience and Stoicism offers a powerful model for leaders. By cultivating a mindset that embraces difficulties as learning opportunities, they prepare themselves to face any challenge that comes their way. This philosophy not only shapes their reactions, but also inspires those around them to adopt a similar approach. The principle of amor fati. The concept of amor fati, which can be translated as love of fate, is one of the central ideas of Stoicism. It involves accepting life as it is with all its ups and downs. For many, this idea may seem challenging, especially in times of crisis. However, leaders who embody this philosophy can navigate adversities more effectively. Trump in his journey exemplified this acceptance in notable ways. During his campaign, Trump faced a series of unexpected challenges. Instead of feeling defeated, he embraced each one as part of his journey. This attitude reflects the essence of amor fati, accepting events as they are without resistance. Instead of lamenting difficulties, he viewed them as opportunities to strengthen his connection with his supporters. Acceptance of circumstances does not imply passivity. In fact, it is an invitation to action. By accepting what cannot be changed, a leader can focus on how to respond effectively. This was evident in critical moments of Trump's campaign, where he not only adapted, but also used adverse situations to reinforce his message. Moreover, amor fati encourages a posture of gratitude. Instead of focusing on what is lacking or what could have been different, a leader who adopts this philosophy recognizes the lessons each experience brings. Throughout his journey, Trump demonstrated this ability to turn challenging situations into valuable learning experiences, reinforcing his resilience. Ultimately, amor fati is not just a passive philosophy, but an invitation to action and transformation. For leaders like Trump, this approach translates into a mindset that does not fear adversities but embraces them. recognizing that each challenge is a vital piece in building a meaningful journey. Strategic indifference. Strategic indifference is a concept that stands out in times of crisis. It refers to a leader's ability to maintain calm and focus on their objectives, regardless of external distractions. This idea is particularly relevant in politics, where emotions can often dominate the scene. Trump, in his journey, demonstrated how this indifference can be a powerful tool. On numerous occasions, Trump faced severe criticism and personal attacks. However, instead of succumbing to these pressures, he often chose to stay focused on his goals. This strategic indifference allowed him to remain unwavering in his central message. By ignoring criticisms and standing firm in his convictions, he was able to attract and maintain the support of his followers. This approach also involves a deep understanding of the nature of criticism. A leader practicing strategic indifference recognizes that not all opinions are relevant or constructive. This enables them to carefully select which feedback is worth their energy. In critical moments, Trump discerned between criticisms that could provide learning opportunities and those that were merely attempts to destabilize him. Additionally, indifference does not mean a lack of empathy. A leader who adopts this stance can still respond to the legitimate concerns of their supporters, but does so in a way that does not compromise their objectives. This ability to balance focus and empathy is crucial in political environments, where emotions often run high. Ultimately, strategic indifference translates into resilience. When a leader can ignore distractions and maintain a clear vision, they not only become stronger but also more inspiring. This ability to stay on course even in the face of storms is one of the hallmarks of an effective and determined leader. Overcoming adversities. Overcoming adversities is a defining characteristic of any leader's journey. For Trump, this was particularly evident during critical moments of his campaign. Instead of succumbing to difficulties, he demonstrated a remarkable ability to rise again and move forward. This resilience is not just a matter of character, but also reflects the Stoic principles he somewhat embraced. During the presidential campaign, Trump faced a series of challenges that could have destabilized many. From media attacks to criticism from political opponents, he was constantly under pressure. However, rather than succumbing to discouragement, he used these experiences to strengthen his message and appeal. Each adversity became an opportunity to reaffirm his beliefs and gain the support of his followers. Stoic principles emphasize the importance of viewing difficulties as a part of life. For Trump, this meant not only accepting challenges but also learning from them. Instead of focusing on losses, he concentrated on the lessons each situation provided. This mindset of continuous learning is essential for any leader seeking not just to survive but to thrive amid adversities. Moreover, overcoming adversities also involves the ability to inspire others. By demonstrating resilience, Trump was able to galvanize his audience, showing that even in the face of difficulties, it is possible to move forward. This emotional connection with his supporters was one of the factors that contributed to his popularity and political success. In the end, overcoming adversities is not just a matter of personal endurance, but also a skill in transforming challenges into opportunities. For leaders like Trump, this approach translates into a continuous cycle of growth and strengthening, both for themselves and for those around them. Leadership under pressure. Leadership under pressure is a recurring theme in politics, and Donald Trump is an example of how this can manifest. In situations of extreme pressure, such as heated debates or moments of national crisis, Trump showed a remarkable ability to remain calm and focus on his goals. This skill is often seen as an essential characteristic of an effective leader. It's interesting to note that in many moments of his journey, pressure was not only present, but also a factor that shaped his decisions. For Trump, these situations were not obstacles, but opportunities to stand out. The Stoic teachings about governance and decision-making are particularly relevant here. Stoics believe that true leadership reveals itself in moments of adversity. The ability to maintain focus and clarity of thought amid chaos is an admirable quality, and for many, a hallmark of great leadership. Trump, on several occasions, demonstrated this ability when responding to crises or criticisms, using pressure as a way to propel his political agenda. This approach directly reflects Stoic principles of self-control and rationality. When discussing leadership under pressure, it's also important to mention the significance of communication. Trump is known for his direct and often controversial style, In moments of crisis, he used this communication to galvanize his audience and reinforce his message. His way of communicating, often challenging traditional norms, can be seen as a leadership strategy that seeks not only to meet momentary demands, but also to shape the narrative around him. This ability to position himself in the face of adversity resonates strongly with Stoic teachings. Another interesting aspect is how Trump handled criticism. Instead of being shaken by negative comments or attacks, he frequently used these situations to reinforce his position. This response, which may seem defensive at first glance, actually reflects a leadership strategy that seeks to transform pressure into a catalyst for growth. His ability to reinvent and adapt is a clear example of how leadership under pressure can manifest in unexpected ways. Finally, leadership under pressure is a skill that can be developed. Stoics believe in practice and discipline as ways to strengthen the mind. For Trump, this practice manifested in how he approached challenges, constantly seeking ways to stand out and assert his presence. Leadership under pressure, therefore, is not just a matter of innate talent, but also of preparation and resilience, qualities that can be cultivated over time. Responses to criticism. Criticism is an integral part of public life, especially for prominent figures like Donald Trump. The way he responded to these criticisms is a fascinating example of how adversity can be transformed into strength. Instead of withdrawing or feeling defeated, Trump often used criticism as fuel for his political narrative. This approach not only helped him grow as a leader, but also positioned him as a figure unafraid to confront his detractors. Stoic philosophy teaches that how we respond to challenges is what truly matters. Trump exemplified this idea by transforming criticism into an opportunity to reaffirm his beliefs and values. This ability to recontextualize criticism is fundamental to resilience and reflects the Stoic idea that we can choose our responses to the situations we face. Rather than being disheartened, he used criticism to solidify his support base, demonstrating that adversity can often be an ally. An interesting aspect of this dynamic is how Trump positioned himself in relation to the media. He frequently called attention to what he considered fake news, using the strategy to discredit unfavorable reports. This response not only challenged the media narrative, but also reinforced his appeal among supporters who felt their concerns were being ignored. This ability to connect with his audience, even in the face of criticism, is a clear example of how leadership can manifest in difficult times. Furthermore, this approach also illustrates the importance of persuasion in politics. Instead of engaging in rational debates about his policies, Trump often opted for a more emotional rhetoric that resonated with his audience. This strategy, which can be seen as a way to deflect criticism, exemplifies a leader's ability to transform challenges into opportunities for engagement. The capacity to connect emotionally with people is a characteristic observed in leaders who, like him, face constant scrutiny. Ultimately, the way Trump handled criticism is a testament to his strength of character. Rather than being shaken, he rose and reinvented himself, demonstrating that criticism can be a springboard for growth. This perspective aligns with Stoic principles of confronting challenges head-on and transforming them into opportunities, which is a crucial aspect of his leadership and can serve as a model for others in similar situations. Mental strength and discipline. Mental strength and discipline are fundamental in any endeavor, and in politics, this becomes even more evident. Donald Trump demonstrated these qualities throughout his career, especially during times of intense pressure. Mental strength refers to the ability to maintain focus and determination in the face of obstacles, while discipline involves the consistent practice of self-control and adherence to an action plan. Together, these qualities form the foundation of effective leadership. Stoic principles emphasize the importance of self-control and perseverance. For Trump, this translated into a methodical approach in his campaign and presidency. Even when faced with significant challenges, he maintained a clear vision of his goals and worked tirelessly to achieve them. This discipline not only helped him overcome adversities, but also allowed him to stay relevant in a constantly changing political landscape. A notable example of this mental strength can be seen during the elections. Trump faced a barrage of criticism and attacks, yet his ability to remain steadfast in his convictions and continue advocating for his policies was admirable. He did not allow difficulties to deter him. Instead, he used these experiences to fortify himself. This mentality echoed Stoic teachings, reminding us that true strength comes from within and that we can control our reactions to external circumstances. Discipline also manifested in how Trump managed his agenda. Despite being frequently criticized for his unconventional approach, he demonstrated a remarkable ability to focus on his priorities. This skill to remain concentrated on established goals, even when distractions arose, is a clear reflection of the discipline required to lead in challenging times. He understood that achieving his objectives required a clear vision and hard work. Ultimately, mental strength and discipline are traits that can be developed over time. Stoic philosophy suggests that through practice and reflection, we can strengthen our minds and enhance our ability to face challenges. Throughout his journey, Trump exemplified this idea, showing that regardless of circumstances, it is possible to cultivate inner strength and discipline to become a more effective leader. This message serves as a powerful reminder that resilience is a skill that can be honed and that everyone can learn to face adversity with courage and determination. The narrative of victory. Constructing a narrative of victory is essential to Stoic philosophy, which emphasizes the significance of how we perceive and interpret our challenges and achievements. In Trump's case, this narrative became a powerful tool throughout his political journey. He not only faced adversities but transformed them into stories of triumph. This ability to shape the narrative around him allowed many of his supporters to feel a connection with him, seeing not just a politician, but someone who understood their struggles. Trump frequently used his speeches and public appearances to reinforce this narrative. He spoke of the obstacles he overcame and how these challenges made him stronger. This approach directly reflects Stoic principles, which teach that difficulties are opportunities for growth. Through his narrative, Trump managed to not only promote himself, but also inspire his followers to view their own struggles as part of a larger journey. Another important aspect of this narrative of victory is how Trump dealt with criticism. Instead of being discouraged, he incorporated it into his story, presenting himself as a fighter who does not give up. This attitude resonated strongly with his supporters, who saw themselves reflected in this constant struggle. Therefore, the narrative of victory is not merely a communication strategy, but a way to emotionally engage people and create a sense of community around a cause. Stoic philosophy also emphasizes the importance of accepting what cannot be controlled and focusing on what can be changed. Trump exemplified this by using his narrative to concentrate on his victories rather than fixating on defeats. By doing so, he not only built an image of resilience but also created a space where his supporters could feel empowered to fight for their own victories, regardless of external circumstances. This construction of a positive storyline was fundamental to his public image. In conclusion, Trump's narrative of victory is a clear example of how Stoic philosophy can be applied in political life. By transforming challenges into success stories, he not only distinguished himself as a leader, but also encouraged a mindset of resilience among his followers. This narrative is not just about winning an election, but about cultivating a spirit of struggle and overcoming that can be applied in various areas of life. The influence of historical events. To understand resilience in modern politics, it is crucial to observe how historical events have shaped the way leaders, including Trump, approach their narratives. Stoic philosophy, which emphasizes acceptance and adaptation to circumstances, becomes even more relevant when analyzing the impact of significant events. From economic crises to social movements, each of these historical moments serves as a reference point for political resilience. Trump positioned himself in a political context where public dissatisfaction was high. The 2008 financial crisis and its social and economic consequences. The 2008 financial crisis and its social and economic repercussions were fundamental in fostering a sentiment of distrust towards traditional leaders. He was able to capitalize on this dissatisfaction by presenting himself as an alternative, an outsider willing to challenge the status quo. This ability to connect with collective frustrations reflects a Stoic concept that resilience is often a response to shared adversities. Moreover, historical events such as wars and international conflicts have also influenced how resilience is perceived in politics. Trump's narrative frequently included references to moments of significant tension, such as the wars in the Middle East, which he argued required a firm and decisive approach. This association between historical events and the need for resilience is a strategy that resonates with Stoic teachings, reminding us that history is a cycle of challenges and triumphs. Resilience is not merely an individual trait, it is shaped by collective contexts. The historical experiences of a nation can influence how its leaders behave in the face of adversity. By recognizing and aligning with these collective sentiments, Trump was able to create a narrative that not only benefited him politically, but also resonated with a large portion of the population. This dynamic illustrates how Stoic philosophy intertwines with history, forming a solid foundation for resilience. Ultimately, reflecting on historical events teaches us that resilience does not arise in a vacuum. It is fueled by shared experiences. The connection between Stoic teachings and modern politics helps us understand that, despite adversities, the capacity to adapt, learn, and move forward is a trait that can be cultivated by individuals and entire societies. Trump's story exemplifies how this collective resilience can be mobilized in favor of a narrative of victory. Universal lessons from Stoic philosophy. The lessons drawn from Trump's experience through the lens of Stoicism are vast and applicable to various areas of life and leadership. Stoic philosophy teaches that life will be filled with challenges, and how we react to them defines our trajectory. Trump exemplified this idea by facing criticism and adversity, demonstrating that resilience is a skill that can be developed. This perspective invites us to reflect on how we can apply these teachings in our own lives. One of the most significant lessons is the importance of self-awareness. Stoic philosophy reminds us to understand our own limitations and strengths. Trump, by acknowledging his flaws while emphasizing his achievements, illustrates how self-awareness can be a powerful tool in leadership. This approach can be applied in any context, whether in politics, business, or personal relationships, showing that self-recognition is crucial for growth. Another valuable lesson is the practice of strategic indifference. This means that instead of being swayed by emotions during a crisis, we should maintain calm and focus on our goals. Trump demonstrated this ability when dealing with challenging situations, adopting a posture that reflected Stoic indifference. This lesson can be crucial for any leader facing external pressures, highlighting the importance of staying true to one's vision and objectives, even in the face of adversity. Resilience is also intrinsically linked to the acceptance of fate. The concept of amor fati, or love of fate, suggests that we should embrace life's circumstances rather than resist them. Trump exemplified this idea by accepting challenges and turning them into opportunities. This lesson is universal and can be applied in various situations, encouraging a mindset that seeks to find the positive amidst the negative. Finally, Stoic philosophy teaches that true strength comes from within. Resilience does not depend solely on external factors, but also on a strong and determined mindset. Trump's experiences remind us that, regardless of circumstances, the ability to persevere and maintain focus on our goals is a skill that everyone can cultivate. These universal lessons from Stoic philosophy encourage us to face life with courage, resilience, and an unwavering will to overcome challenges. Thus, throughout this journey, we witness how a businessman transformed into an unlikely warrior. Even without a deep understanding of Stoic teachings, he embodied principles that shaped his path: resilience in the face of criticism, and the ability to turn adversities into opportunities, exemplify how Stoicism can manifest in everyday life. The amor fati concept, this acceptance of fate, was present in crucial moments, showing that viewing difficulties as essential parts of the journey can be liberating, and strategic indifference, so valued by Stoics, proved to be a powerful weapon amidst chaos, allowing him to remain steadfast and focused. Now, the reflection arises. How can you apply these teachings in your life? What challenges do you face that can be transformed into opportunities? Remember, mental strength is not just about not falling, but about having the courage to rise every time it's necessary. If you enjoyed this content, don't forget to leave your like and share your experiences in the comments. Stoicism teaches us that each of us can be an unlikely warrior in our own story. Let's explore more about this philosophy that transforms lives together.